I really appreciate it. And this is a good time for me to say that I'm so pleased to be speaking here, but I did not notice when I was invited that the conference would be held via Zoom. And you'll hear as I talk about my my own story and talk about my perspective on these issues that, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So sorry to use a proprietary system, but sadly, GeoJitsu is it's good also, but people are less used.
Yeah, there are plenty of great alternatives like Big Blue Button, and FOSDEM is a conference that was held with over 30,000 people and was using simply Big Blue Button along with actually I think it was Jitsi with
Great.
Matrix.
Marion, we could see your screen and know
it was working.
Yeah,
yes, it's working perfectly.
Perfect.
No, thank you so much. You can move to the second screen, and you'll hear everybody why I care so much about this issue as I introduce myself. So you can go to the next slide, Marion.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm trying. Oh.
So this is the introduction to me, which is that you can go back one slide, which is that I have oh no, you're gone forward. It's all fine. This is all heart related things. I have a big heart. I have a heart condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which means that I'm at a very high risk of suddenly dying. It's fine. My heart is just a little bit thick, and the way that that I handle that situation, I'm basically asymptomatic. And you can go to the next slide, Marion. Is that I have a pacemaker defibrillator implanted in my in my body, and having that caused me to, and being a technical person, caused me to do a lot of research on this. And this is actually my old defibrillator, and you can see the dents in it from where it was pried out of my body. So you can go to the next slide. Being told that I needed software implanted in my body, of course, like any good technical person, I went and researched this and realized that medical devices are, in fact, extremely vulnerable to attack, and their security historically has not been very good. And realizing that I could not see the source code in my own body, I'm an engineer turned lawyer. Of course, this made me do a tremendous amount of research into the safety and efficacy of these devices. And what I found really horrified me. And so I published an article entitled Kill by Code, which was all about software transparency in medical devices. And I really thought that I had figured this out, that like what we needed were are making sure that we had access to review the safety of the devices that we had, that we relied on. You can move to the next slide, Marion. And all of that made me extremely passionate about being able to have transparency and see the software that we rely on. And so I went to work at the Software Freedom Conservancy, where I work now. We're a 501c3, which in the US is a charitable nonprofit, and we are focused on a number of strategies that help increase the public's control of our own software, namely through free and open source software. So you can go to the next slide. Thanks. And I put in this slide, I know I already gave my little spiel about let's not use Zoom, but it's funny to talk about what, it's really funny to talk about access to data, access to our technology, and to continue to use proprietary systems to do it. I think like it can be inconvenient to convene on platforms that people aren't as comfortable with, but in the long run, it pays off because we'll improve those alternatives, and then we'll be able to have access to them rather than having. And I'm aware that that this is being streamed on Facebook, which is great, because I hope that all of you who are watching on Facebook take a minute to think about, like, whether this is the best use of our technology, and being able to use alternatives. And this slide is of a tweet showing how some places are using free technology in order to create alternatives that are owned by by local groups, so that we don't have to worry about surveillance by third-party companies or data being sent through even countries that we haven't even anticipated. You could move to the next slide, Marion. I'm sorry to be a broken record on it. Thank you. This is a picture of me a few years ago when I was pregnant, and in Spain it was beautiful. But the reason why I have this picture of me in here is that while I was pregnant, my heart my heart was, I had palpitations, which is super common amongst pregnant women. A very large percentage of pregnant women, they estimate either a quarter or a third, have palpitations. But because I had a defibrillator, even though I wasn't really actively using it, it was just preventative, it shocked me unnecessarily repeatedly, simply because I had a defibrillator. And like once I got over the shock of being shocked, I started to think about what this meant. And what this meant was that my technology wasn't necessarily made for me. Nobody at the device manufacturers had any desire for pregnant ladies to get shocked, but defibrillators are all given to people, or well, 85% of defibrillators are given to people over the age of 65. Fewer than half of defibrillators are given to women. And so the set of people who have defibrillators and are pregnant is teeny tiny. And it made me think, what else about our technology is not, it doesn't line up with what we need it to be. And as we deploy our technology into different places, different, different parts of the world for different uses, we're going to see this more and more. And the only way that we will be able to have meaningful control over our technology is if we have access to all of the source code so I became extremely passionate, not just about software transparency, which is what I thought it was all about before, but actually about us being able to have control over our technology so that we can change it and anticipate our own needs, not the needs that were intended when the devices were created. You can go to the next slide, Marion. Thanks. And at the same time, I think that's just background noise. Is anyone trying to ask a question? Okay.
No,
so
I think somebody forgot to unmute.
Yeah, no problem. We'll just keep going. So at the same time, I learned about this 2010 study called the Honeymoon Effect, which examined vulnerabilities in software over time, as opposed to just the number of bugs. And it found that for a period of time, there was like a honeymoon effect where no vulnerabilities were known, which was counterintuitive, because you would think that when software was new, people would be, it would be likely that vulnerabilities would be exposed. But in fact, for a variety of other reasons, that are basically speculative, we think that there's this period of time called the researchers called it the honeymoon effect, where for a period of time there are no known vulnerabilities, but once you find vulnerabilities, they increase at an almost exponential rate. And what this tells us is that we don't have to worry about our critical software at the moment it's deployed. We have to worry about it down the road, right? When relationships with suppliers have broken down, when people have moved on from companies. And for me, my device, they told me that it might last, this current device that I have, that I should hope that it lasts 17 years. And, in 17 years, things will be really different. And I have to have this device for this time. And as we think about issues around our lifespan and extending it, relying on our critical technology and knowing what we can do with it becomes even more critical. We can go to the next slide. Thanks. And so what we're seeing is that where there is access to control over our devices and healthcare, people are doing really exciting things. There's this great, there are people who are using their insulin pumps to create closed loop systems and to give themselves much better outcomes in the long run. But at the same time, it's creating this really strange situation where we're looking for where people need devices, and these devices, they were able to do this, create this closed loop system because there were insulin pumps that had a security vulnerability on them that they were able to exploit to improve their own healthcare. It's just wild. You can go to the next slide. And at the same time, we see all kinds of breakdowns in the way that there's this mismatch between the way that the manufacturers create our technology and how it plays out in reality. And so here's an example. There are many different examples of this, but there are a whole line of soap dispensers where if you put a light colored hand under a soap dispenser, soap comes out. But if you put a dark hand under the soap dispenser, nothing happens until that person puts a paper towel on top of it. It's wild. And the answer with that is that, well, there probably was nobody who was dark skinned on their testing team or on their developmental team, or they would have known. You can go to the next slide. That this happened. And so this is a real problem across technology. And what we've found is that our technology is whether in some places deliberately exclusionary, and in other cases just inadvertently exclusionary. And so we at Conservancy created a program called Outreachy, where we give internships to people who have been subject to systemic bias or underrepresented in tech. You can go to the next slide. And so I'm gonna. This is a picture of me getting my defibrillator checked, because all of these devices are wirelessly connected. And when I got my new defibrillator, I've discovered that there was only one device on the market in the United States that does not broadcast remotely. You can go to the next slide. And what I found out from all of that is that, or what I realized about this is that people their devices are broadcasting, they're not thinking about it, and that data is being collected in all kinds of ways. Now, but when I got my device, the question is really like, do you want to die suddenly of your heart condition, or do you want this device? It's consent, but it's not meaningful consent. Were no alternatives, right? We are in a situation where we're present. Yeah, you can move ahead. Thanks, Mary. No, good. We've got to move on. This is a picture of 4 other activists in the digital medical space arena, who are all working on different pieces of the issues. So I've been really focused on software freedom. I want access to my source code. I want to be able to work with other people who have my situation and make it better for all of us. And then each of these people is working on another piece of the problem. Patient access to data, hacking the devices to show vulnerabilities. You can go to the next slide. But previous to a couple of years ago, we were completely uncoordinated, and I realized that now we much like Agbalade, I realized that we really need to coalesce around the principles that will govern our own autonomy and the way we think about technology from space to space, because each of our niches are no longer enough. We have to think holistically about all of these issues. And so along with Molly DeBlanc, I wrote a Declaration of Digital Autonomy, which is actually at draft point 2 now, at techautonomy.org. So please take a look at it. My principles are actually pretty, in some ways similar to Agbalade's. So I'm curious to get your feedback. But yeah, so check that out. I think that we really need to focus on how our technology is impacting people from a fairness and a justice perspective. You can go to the next slide. And the truth is that the use of free and open source software and the use of free data sets has powered a lot of the big data and AI initiatives that have been happening. But what happens is that these companies are exploiting the commons and they're not giving back. And worse than not giving back, they're creating algorithms and implementations that are discriminatory. And most of you, I think, are experts on these, so I'm not going to give examples. But what is interesting is that it's riding on the backs of what the free and open world has accomplished, including using libraries of free software code to write more code without giving back. So we're in this really bad situation where we're getting less and less access, less and less freedom, less and less control over our devices, less and less control over all of this that we rely on, and then also less and less insight into the algorithms and decisions that are impacting us, and less input into how healthcare is distributed, while the realities of our current economic outlook are basically exacerbating the inequalities. We've seen so much wonderful promise from free and open technology being used in the health space. We saw valves being 3D printed and information being shared. And then invariably, we've seen it continue to go back to a proprietary, non-sharing, non-collaborative model. We see, for example, Medtronic ventilators that are, where plans are being shared temporarily so that people can use them, patent grants that are temporary so that we're addressing this pandemic, but not future pandemics. And unless we share our source code, and unless we collaborate, unless we keep our data sets as free as possible and create algorithms that are transparent and testable, we will never be able to make great strides for equitable distribution of healthcare and the realization of longevity for a large portion of the population. I think there's is this the last slide next? Yeah, and so there's just a little silly slide that basically shows that, with software freedom and with other sharing mechanisms and with other transparency and openness initiatives, that when we get to our end of life of a product, of a device, if a company decides to end of life its product, it's not the end of life for us. Right. I want to make sure that at the end of the day, when whether it's, I highly doubt my device will last 17 years, but say my device lasts a decade, when I get to when the company decides not to update it, will I need to get surgery to replace it? Possibly. Wouldn't it be great if I could just upgrade that software? Wouldn't it be great if, as we all become and unbecome cyborgs, if we have control over our own digital destinies? I think there's one last slide with just our
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me and for having this discussion. It's all really interesting.
Thank you very much, Karen. I would have many questions to ask, but I will not, because I will only read. Well, one question is to lol, don't cause Facebook AI to block us for criticizing them. But seriously, did it happen already for you that you were saying something and that it was stopped by Facebook? I'm curious. And then the let's say serious question, but it's interesting. What are the main, that was the question of Sven, and here it's a question of Peter. What are the main obstacles quoted when you ask suppliers to open source their code? And then I have a third question, but I will ask you to, well, maybe you can choose, or you have only normally 1 minute, but 2 minutes, it's okay, or 3. Has data privacy and ownership yet been mentioned regarding the use of blockchains for personal health data?
Okay, I will do my best to answer what I can quickly. As far as Facebook, I've never been officially blocked by Facebook, but I do find that Facebook is the best place to advocate against Facebook. So I avoid Facebook and generally don't use it except to advocate against it. And it's not, I'm not trying to be moralistic or preachy about it. It's just that we'll be so much better off if we can take our conversations elsewhere where we have control over it. And there are so many distributed places to talk. Just maybe hop on Mastodon and check out it's an alternative to Twitter. And just Activity Pub, which allows you to talk across different platforms. It's really there are so many things we can do. The main obstacles in talking to device manufacturers, it's funny because I think initially there's device manufacturers just get their back up because they don't want to share anything more than they have to. I believe that that it's one of those situations where they use a fear of patents in order to not share anything. So developers that I know that work at medical device companies say that the motivations for not wanting to share the software or other information that's closely related to the devices is really about not wanting to take the time or invest the resources to clean up the code base and to provide that information to the public. And it just would take them a lot of time and effort, because the distinguishing components about their devices are not related necessarily to the software algorithms. But what they say is that because they're worried about software patents, that they can't release their code. So yeah, so that's it. I mean, so for data privacy, maybe I think we're out of time, but maybe we'll get to that on the panel, possibly.
Yeah. Yes, maybe. Yeah. Okay, it's okay. We are not so much late, and the next speaker is the worst one, because it's me. So let's take the question of Sven. It's a question I'm asking myself sometimes. Is there a risk where you make the source code of say implanted defibrillators open that this may make it easier for bad actors to hack these devices and cause harm?
Oh, it's such a good question. And this is the classic, fear that enters, but it's counterintuitive, because what really happens is that these devices are all exploitable, even though their source code is not shared. So for my device, my old device, that the researchers were able to take control of the device, give unnecessary shocks, run down the battery, get private information from the defibrillators, including doctors' names and social security numbers in the US. The devices are all vulnerable regardless of whether the source code is available. And so while it's true that there may be some ways in which malicious hackers could exploit having the source code available, the ability for anyone to fix that problem and to evaluate that code and identify those vulnerabilities is so much greater than any vulnerabilities that it would introduce, because researchers show that security through obscurity just doesn't work. So when you try to rely on security by not publishing your source code, it does not actually result in secure technology. In fact, quite the opposite.
Okay. Thank you very much, Karen, and we see each other again for the general debate with Thierry, also Stefan and Ben. And now,